The morning Bessie Talbot knocked on the door of the Turner ranch. The dirt on Wesley Turner's boots was still the same dirt from the graveyard, and she could see by the hollow way he stood in the doorframe that he had not yet decided whether he wanted to go on living. The year was 1874, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas, sat at the edge of everything, the edge of the cattle trail, the edge of civilization, and on mornings like this one, the edge of a man's endurance. Bessie was 26 years old, a widow herself by 2 years, and she had heard about the posting from old Hazel Prout at the dry goods store the very afternoon that Ellen Turner had been put in the ground. Hazel had pressed the scrap of paper into Bessie's palm with the certainty of a woman who knew something about survival, and Bessie had walked the 2 miles to the ranch before she could talk herself out of it. She stood on the porch with her carpetbag at her feet, and her chin lifted in a way that was equal parts pride and nervousness, and she looked at Wesley Turner for the first time in her life. He was 30 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water after a hard rain, not quite green, not quite gray, and full of something she recognized immediately because she had seen it in her own mirror for 2 solid years. Grief. The kind that didn't announce itself with crying but with a terrible, exhausted stillness. "The posting said you need a housekeeper," Bessie said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. Wesley looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Behind him, through the open door, she could see a kitchen with dishes stacked unwashed, a floor that needed sweeping, and a cast iron pot on the stove that had not been cleaned in what looked like several days. There were 2 small children somewhere in the house, she could hear them, a quiet shuffling that broke her heart because children that age should not be that quiet. "How much you want for the work?" Wesley said at last. $8 a month, room and board," Bessie said. "If you have a spare room." "I have a spare room," he said, and stepped back from the doorway without saying anything else, which she took as an invitation. She carried her own bag inside. The spare room was small but clean, with a window that faced east and a narrow bed with a quilt folded at the foot that someone had made with great care. She set her bag down and did not allow herself to look at the quilt too long, because she understood without being told that Ellen Turner had made it. She went to the kitchen and started with the dishes. The 2 children found her there within the hour. The older one was a boy named Thomas, 7 years old, with his father's gray-green eyes and a serious expression that did not belong on a child that young. The younger one was a girl named Clara, who was 5 and had her mother's blonde hair, Bessie would learn this later, from a photograph on the mantelpiece, and who came to stand at the kitchen doorway and stare at Bessie with the frank, unguarded curiosity that belongs only to small children and does not care about social propriety. "Are you staying?" Clara asked. "For as long as your father needs me," Bessie said. "Daddy needs someone to make the biscuits," Thomas said very seriously. "He burned them twice." Bessie looked at the boy for a moment and felt something move in her chest, something quiet and determined. "Then I will make the biscuits," she said. She made supper that first evening: salt pork, beans cooked with molasses, cornbread, and dried apple slices she found in a tin on the top shelf. She set the table for 4, and when Wesley came in from the barn at dusk, he stopped at the sight of the table with a full supper on it and the lantern lit and his children already seated and waiting, and the look on his face was not happiness exactly, but it was something, a tiny loosening of the tightness around his eyes, a breath he had perhaps not taken fully in 2 days. He sat down. He looked at his plate. He said, "Thank you, Miss Talbot," in a voice that was rough at the edges. "Bessie," she said, "please." He nodded once and they ate. That was how it began. In the weeks that followed, Bessie learned the rhythms of the Turner ranch the way you learn any new landscape, slowly, with attention, and with the understanding that every place has its own private logic. The ranch was modest by the standards of some, but respectable. Wesley ran about 200 head of cattle with the help of 2 ranch hands. A gruff Mexican man named Hector Vargas, who had worked for the Turners for 6 years and spoke little but worked without complaint. and a young man of 19 named Pete Alcott, who was from Ohio, and still had the faint bewilderment of someone who had not yet made peace with the fact that the West was harder than advertised. The land was flat and wide and beautiful in a way that took some getting used to, with grass that turned gold in the afternoon light, and skies so enormous that on some evenings standing outside felt like standing at the bottom of a bowl of heaven. The wind was nearly constant. It carried dust in summer and cold in winter, and the smell of the Kisham Trail in driving season, when the great herds moved north and the whole world seemed to rumble. Bessie cooked, cleaned, mended, washed, and cared for Thomas and Clara with a quiet competence that asked for nothing in return but the doing of the thing itself. She was not a woman who performed her feelings, and she did not try to replace what the children had lost. Instead, she was simply present, steady and warm, and reliable in the way a good fire is reliable, not flashy but genuinely sustaining. Wesley barely spoke to her for the first 2 weeks. He said please and thank you and what he needed when he needed it, and he worked from before dawn to after dark in the way that men do when they are trying to outrun something that is living inside their own chest. Bessie understood this too. After her husband James had died of fever 2 years ago, she had scrubbed every floor in her small house 3 times in 1 week just to have something to do with her hands. She did not push. She cooked his meals and left him to his grief, as though it were a room she had been asked not to enter. It was Thomas who began to bridge things, as children sometimes do without knowing it. One evening in the 3rd week, Thomas came to Bessie after supper with an arithmetic problem he was struggling with from the reader he was working through, because there was no schoolhouse in riding distance, and Wesley had been teaching the children himself in the evenings before Ellen died and had not resumed it since. Bessie sat with the boy at the kitchen table and worked through the problem with him, and then, because Thomas was quick and hungry for it, worked through 3 more. Wesley came in from outside while this was happening and stood in the doorway watching without saying anything, and Bessie looked up and met his eyes briefly before looking back down at the slate. He came and sat at the table too, on the far side, and opened the ranch ledger he had been meaning to work on, and the 4 of them sat together in the lantern light, Wesley with his ledger, Bessie with Thomas and his arithmetic, Clara drawing shapes in the dust on the side of the table with her finger until Wesley gently told her to stop. And it was the first thing that felt something close to an ordinary evening in that house since Ellen Turner had died. "You're good with him," Wesley said, when the children had gone to bed and he was still sitting with the ledger. Bessie was washing the supper dishes. She did not turn around. "He's a good student," she said. "He just needs someone to sit with him." There was a pause. "I should be doing that," Wesley said. The words came out roughly, with a quality she recognized as self-reproach. "You're doing what you can," she said. She said it without judgment because that was the truth of it. A man keeping 200 head of cattle alive and a ranch from falling apart while grief sat on him like a second skin was doing what he could, and there was no sense in making it harder. He did not say anything more, but the next evening he sat with Thomas himself for the arithmetic, and Bessie listened from the kitchen and heard the low sound of the man's voice working through numbers with his son, and something in her quiet heart settled a little further. The autumn came quickly to Caldwell that year, sweeping down from the north with a cold that had teeth. Bessie put up preserves from the kitchen garden, what was left of it, since it had been somewhat neglected in the weeks before and after Ellen's death, and mended the children's coats, and made sure the firewood was stacked properly and the windows sealed against the draft. She found in the back of the pantry a crock of Ellen Turner's apple butter, and she used it sparingly and carefully through the winter, aware that she was using something irreplaceable. In November, a storm came down off the plains that lasted 3 days and kept everyone inside. The cattle were brought in close, and Hector and Pete bedded down in the bunkhouse, and the 5 inhabitants of the ranch house were confined together by walls of wind and snow. It was during this storm that Bessie and Wesley first truly talked. They sat by the fire on the second night after the children had gone to sleep, and Wesley, who had been quiet all day with an agitation that had nothing to do with the weather, finally said something he had apparently been working up to for some time. "Ellen had this chest cough since last summer," he said. "I kept thinking she'd shake it. I kept telling her she'd shake it." He was looking at the fire, not at Bessie. The doctor in Wichita said there was nothing to be done after a while. She lasted longer than he thought she would. She was always stubborn like that. Bessie set down the sock she was darning. "How long were you married?" she asked. 8 years, he said. "Came out here from Missouri together, when Clara was just a baby. Ellen wanted to go west. She had this notion about the land." He made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "She loved it here, the big sky. She used to go out in the morning and just stand there and look at it." Bessie thought of the quilt on her bed, the careful, loving work in every stitch. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," she said. "She was," Wesley said simply. Then, after a moment, "I don't know how to do this. Any of this, the managing of it." "You are doing it," Bessie said, "poorly." "No," she said, with a firmness that surprised him enough that he looked at her. "Imperfectly, which is different. Your children are fed and clothed and loved, and they know it. The ranch is still standing. You are still standing." She held his gaze. "That is not nothing, Wesley Turner." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not entirely read. Then he looked back at the fire. But some of the agitation had left him, and they sat together in a quieter way after that, listening to the wind howl against the shutters and the fire speak in its crackling language. And it was the first time in her memory that sitting with another adult in the evening felt like something she had been missing, rather than something she was simply doing out of circumstance. When the storm cleared, Wesley rode out to check the herd, and Bessie made a large batch of molasses cookies with the children, and Clara ate 3 before supper and was not even slightly sorry about it. And Thomas ate 4 and pretended he had only eaten 2, which Bessie observed and did not mention. When Wesley came back cold and tired and sat down to supper, Clara climbed into his lap with cookie crumbs still on her face, and told him everything they had done that day in breathless detail. And Wesley listened and held his daughter and looked at Bessie over the top of Clara's golden head with an expression that said, simply, "Thank you," without the words needing to be spoken at all. Winter passed. The new year came, 1875, and with it the slow return of warmth to the land. The cattle drives would begin again in the spring, and Wesley threw himself into preparation with the focused energy of a man who understood that the only real remedy for grief was forward motion. He did not forget Ellen. He never forgot Ellen. But the terrible paralysis of those first weeks had lifted, replaced by something harder and more functional, a man rebuilding himself from the inside out with the raw materials of work and routine, and the demands of 2 children who needed him. In the spring, Bessie planted the kitchen garden in earnest. She was on her knees in the dirt one April morning, coaxing the first rows of beans into the ground, when Pete Alcott came by and offered to help, and they worked side by side for an hour while Pete talked about Ohio with a homesickness that was almost sweet. Bessie listened and asked him questions, because she had found that lonely young men needed an audience more than advice, and after that Pete Alcott had a devoted respect for Bessie Talbot that expressed itself in small, useful ways: wood chopped without being asked, buckets carried, fences checked near the garden where the cattle sometimes leaned against them. One afternoon in May, a man came to the ranch that Bessie did not like the look of. His name was Dylan Marsh, and he rode in with 2 other men, and a manner that had the easy insolence of someone who considered himself dangerous and wanted others to know it. He was a buyer from the north, or so he claimed, and he wanted to talk to Wesley about purchasing a portion of the herd at a price that Wesley, looking at the numbers, knew was below fair by enough to matter. Bessie had brought out water and stayed near the porch while the men talked, watching the exchange with the quiet attention of a woman who had learned, in years of managing on her own, to read a conversation from a distance. She saw the way Marsh's eyes moved around the property with a calculating quality that had nothing to do with cattle buying, and she saw the moment Wesley's jaw set with the polite stubbornness of a man who was not going to be cheated and knew it. Wesley declined the offer. Marsh pushed back, with a smile that was not a smile, and then Wesley simply stood up and said the conversation was over, and Hector materialized from the side of the barn at that moment with his arms crossed, which he had a gift for, and Marsh and his associates departed in a way that was not quite retreat but was close enough to it. That evening Wesley told Bessie what Marsh had offered, and she did some quick arithmetic in her head. "That's barely 70 cents on the dollar," she said. "About that," Wesley agreed. "You'll do better at the market in Wichita," she said. "Hector knows the buyers there. He worked the trail for 3 seasons before he came to you." Wesley looked at her with a faint curiosity. "How do you know that?" "He told me," she said simply. "He talks if you listen in the right way." Wesley smiled at that. It was the first time she had seen him smile fully, without the shadow behind it, and it rearranged his face into something that startled her a little. He was, she realized, not simply a grieving man or a hard-working man or a kind father. He was also, beneath all of it, genuinely handsome, with a warmth in his expression when it appeared that made you want to earn it again. She looked away from him and back at the supper she was stirring, and told herself firmly that she was a housekeeper, and that was a thing she meant to remain. In June, Wesley drove the herd north to Wichita with Hector and Pete, and Bessie ran the ranch with Thomas and Clara, and an elderly dog named Admiral who was mostly blind and slept near the stove and served as a kind of anchor for the children. She was competent and unafraid. She had grown up on a farm in Missouri, and there was very little about running a working property that intimidated her. She checked the fences, kept the kitchen garden growing, managed the small amount of cash Wesley had left her for necessities, and read to the children every evening from the Bible, and from the one slim novel she had brought with her in her carpetbag, a copy of David Copperfield that was missing its last 30 pages, which had always seemed to her a kind of injustice. Thomas asked her once, while Wesley was away, whether she would leave when his father came back. Bessie put down her mending and looked at the boy. "Why would I leave?" she asked. Thomas considered this with his characteristic gravity. "Some women don't stay," he said. "Mrs. Hatch left the Dillons after one winter." "I am not Mrs. Hatch," Bessie said, "and I like it here." Thomas seemed to evaluate this answer for its truthfulness and then accept it. "Good," he said, and went back to his book. The truth of the matter was that Bessie had surprised herself with how much she meant it. She had come to the Turner ranch out of necessity. She had been low on money and lower on options, and a widow without family in Caldwell was in a precarious position in 1874, dependent on the good will of neighbors and the hope that respectability and hard work were worth something. She had not expected to find herself settling into the place as though it had been waiting for her shape, but she had. The ranch had become something real to her, the wide mornings, and the sound of the cattle in the distance, and the smell of wood smoke, and the east-facing window in her small room that showed her the dawn every day without fail, as reliable as a promise. The children had become something real to her. And Wesley Turner, she was slowly and somewhat nervously acknowledging, had become something real to her too. Not in a way she acted on or even fully named to herself yet, but in the way you become aware of a change in weather before it arrives, a shift in pressure, a new quality of the air, something coming that has not yet declared itself. Wesley came back from Wichita in mid-July with fair money for the cattle and a paper sack of lemon drops from the confectioners in town for the children, and he was sunburned and tired and looked, she thought, more himself than she had ever seen him. The months of hard work had done something for him. He had the look of a man who had walked through something terrible and come out the other side still standing, which was not the same as being healed, but was its own kind of victory. He gave Clara her lemon drops, and Clara immediately tried to give one to Admiral, who was not interested. He gave Thomas a small folding knife that Thomas received with a solemnity appropriate to receiving a sacred object. And then he turned to Bessie, and she had expected nothing, but he reached into the sack again and produced a small blue book. "Bookshop in Wichita had this," he said, handing it to her. "Thought you might want it." It was the complete edition of David Copperfield. She stood holding it with a feeling she could not immediately organize into words. "How did you know?" she asked. "Thomas told me about your copy," Wesley said. He was trying not to look too pleased with himself. "Said you'd been reading it to them and they couldn't find out how it ended." She looked up at him. He was looking at her with the warmth in his expression that she had been trying not to notice, and she felt the warmth land somewhere she was not entirely prepared for it. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was quieter than she intended. "It's nothing," he said, which they both understood was not true. Summer moved into fall, and the comfortable architecture of their daily life at the ranch continued to build itself. Wesley had resumed teaching the children in the evenings, and on the nights when he was tired or when a particular lesson stumped him. He was fine with arithmetic, but history gave him trouble, and his spelling, which he would never have admitted to anyone who was not already aware of it, was unreliable. Bessie sat with him, and they worked through it together at the kitchen table. And there was a closeness in those shared evenings that was entirely natural, and that neither of them acknowledged aloud, because to acknowledge it would be to make it into something, and neither of them was quite ready for it to be something. But they were circling something, the way planets circle a sun, inevitable and constant, and following a law neither had written. In September, there was a dance in town. The dances in Caldwell in those years were held in the town hall, which was a simple plank building with a good wood floor, and they were serious social events in the way that entertainment was always serious on the frontier, where it was rare enough to be precious. Bessie had not been to a dance since before James died. She had a dress that was suitable, a dark green wool with cream lace at the collar, which was the best thing she owned, and when Wesley mentioned the dance to her with a careful casualness that she saw through immediately, she said yes before she could think about it too much. Hector and Pete watched the children, and Wesley and Bessie drove into town in the wagon on a cool September evening, with a sky full of stars that sprawled across the dark in the extravagant way that the plain sky always did, as though it was showing off. They did not dance with each other at first. There were other men who asked Bessie. She was not the kind of woman men overlooked, with her dark auburn hair and the steady directness of her brown eyes, and the quality she had of being entirely present in whatever she was doing. And she danced a reel and a polka with two of them while Wesley stood at the side of the room, and she was aware of him standing there without looking at him directly, in the way you are aware of a fire in a room without staring at it. And then the fiddle player shifted into something slower, and Wesley appeared at her side, and without speaking he offered his hand and she took it. They danced. He was not a polished dancer, but he was steady, which was better, and he held her with a careful respect that was also unmistakably something more than respect. She could feel his hand at her back, warm through the wool of her dress, and they moved together in the lantern light while the fiddle sang something sweet and old, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything, because nothing that needed to be said could be said with words yet. When the song ended, they stepped apart. The moment closed over itself like water over a stone. They drove home in a comfortable silence that was warmer than many conversations she had had, and when they reached the ranch and Wesley helped her down from the wagon, his hands at her waist briefly, steadying her landing, he said good night, and she said good night, and they went inside to check on the sleeping children, and then to their separate rooms on opposite ends of the house. Bessie lay awake for a long time looking at the pattern of moonlight on her ceiling and telling herself she was being foolish. She was his housekeeper. He was her employer. That was a clear and sensible arrangement, and she had no business letting her heart get complicated about it. She got up and read 3 chapters of David Copperfield and fell asleep with the book on her chest, and had a dream she could not quite remember in the morning, but that left her with a feeling of warmth that stayed with her through breakfast. Wesley burned the coffee that morning. He rarely burned the coffee. He was distracted, which she pretended not to notice. The fall drove on, and the first snow came in October that year. A light dusting that delighted Clara and was treated by Thomas with the serious consideration he gave all natural phenomena worth studying. Life at the ranch was full and busy and good in the uncomplicated way that hard work and clear purpose and good company can make things good. And then, in early November, Bessie got sick. It was not serious a chest cold that most people in Caldwell were fighting that season, carried in on the cold winds from the north, but it knocked her thoroughly off her feet for 4 days, which was enough to unsettle the entire household. She lay in her small room with the east-facing window and a splitting headache and a cough that made her ribs ache, and she hated being laid low with a passion that was almost as intense as the illness itself. Wesley brought her meals. This was the remarkable thing. He brought her soup that he had made himself, beef broth with dried herbs that was simple but nourishing, and tea with honey, and he knocked before he entered, which she had not expected him to bother with, and he set things down on the small table beside her bed with a gentleness that was entirely inconsistent with his usual economy of motion. "You don't have to do this," she said, the second time he appeared with the soup. "You've been feeding us for going on a year and a half," he said. "I think I can manage soup. The children, Thomas helped me with supper last night and was very proud of himself," Wesley said. "And Clara has decided she is going to be your nurse and has appointed herself to the role, and I am not going to tell her otherwise, because it is giving her a sense of purpose." As if summoned, Clara appeared in the doorway holding a cup of water with both hands and the expression of someone performing a sacred duty. Bessie looked at the small girl and felt something that was so tangled up with love and gratitude and a deep, aching tenderness that she could not even try to separate the threads. On the third day, Wesley sat in the chair beside her bed and read to her from David Copperfield. He was not a natural reader aloud, and his voice stumbled over some of the longer words, but he kept going, and his voice was deep and warm, and she lay in the gray light of a November afternoon and listened to him read and thought, "I am in terrible trouble. Not the kind of trouble that was bad. The kind of trouble that was real." She recovered on the 4th day and was back in the kitchen on the 5th, which Wesley objected to on the grounds that she was not yet fully herself. She told him she was perfectly capable of determining when she was herself, and he said she was stubborn as a post oak, and she said that was a description she would accept, and they stood in the kitchen looking at each other with the exasperated warmth of people who are having an argument about something that is not the argument, and then Bessie turned back to the stove, and Wesley went out to the barn, and the moment passed. But it was the moment that made things clear, even if neither of them was ready to say so. Winter came in full force in December of 1875, and the ranch hunkered down against it with the particular self-sufficiency of frontier life. Christmas was a quiet celebration. Bessie made a dried fruit cake, and the children each received a small present, and Wesley produced a bottle of brandy he had been saving and poured 2 glasses after the children were in bed, and they sat by the fire and drank their brandy and talked for a long time, really talked, in the way you do when the world outside is cold and closed, and the fire is the center of everything. She told him about James, what he had been like, how they had met in Missouri at a church social, the 2 years of their marriage before the fever took him, the particular loneliness of being a young widow in a place where you had not yet put down enough roots to anchor you. She had not told anyone most of this. It came out easily by the fire with the brandy and the winter outside, and Wesley listened the way he did everything with his full attention, without trying to fix it. He told her more about Ellen. The details that were privately his, how she had laughed, what had annoyed her, the way she had been fiercely opinionated about small things and quietly firm about large ones, how she had loved this land with a romantic ferocity that had surprised him sometimes, a man more practical than romantic by nature. He said he still talked to her sometimes in his head, when things were difficult, and that he thought this was perhaps not unusual. I talked to James too, Bessie said, for the first year. Sometimes I still do. Does it help? Yes, she said. I think they would want us to be all right. He looked at her with the fire reflected in his gray-green eyes. Yes, he said quietly, I think they would. It was the closest they came to naming it that winter. But it was named, in the way it needed to be named, not with declarations but with a shared recognition, a quiet mutual understanding that settled between them like something that had been waiting to be put down. Spring of 1876 brought its own news. The town of Caldwell was growing, with a new general store and a schoolhouse that was finally being built, which meant that Thomas, now 9, and Clara, now 7, would be able to go to proper school in the fall. The cattle trade was good and the ranch was prospering in a modest, solid way. The world was beginning to feel, for the first time in a long time, like a place that was pointed in a good direction. In April, Bessie was at the pump in the kitchen yard when Hector came by with a look on his face that meant he had something to say and was working out how to say it. "There is a man named Marsh," he said finally. Bessie looked up. "Dylan Marsh." "He has been buying up land around here," Hector said. "He has been talking to some of the smaller ranchers, offering low money, and then, when they don't take it, things happen to them. Water supply gets fouled, fence gets cut, cattle get spooked off." He paused. "He wants Wesley's land. It is good water land." Bessie set down the water bucket. "Have you told Wesley?" "I am telling you because you will tell him in the way that he will hear it," Hector said, which was the plainest thing she had ever heard Hector Vargas say, and which told her something about how she was perceived on this ranch that she had not quite put together before. She told Wesley that evening. He listened with the same focused stillness he brought to everything that mattered, and then he went to Wichita the following week, and came back with a lawyer's letter filed with the county registrar, establishing clear documentation of his land boundaries and water rights. And he also came back with a general understanding that Marsh had a less than clean reputation with the county officials, and that documented records were the man's greatest deterrent. There was no showdown, no violence, just the quiet, effective work of a man who understood that the best defense was a clear legal record, which was unglamorous but deeply effective. Marsh eventually moved his attentions elsewhere. The threat receded. The ranch was safe. The summer of 1876 was beautiful and hot and full. The children went to the new school in the fall and came home every day full of the world, new friends, new ideas, new arguments about things they had learned that morning. The house was noisier and more alive than it had ever been since Bessie had arrived, and she felt the vitality of it in her bones like something nourishing. And one evening in October, 2 years and some months after she had come to the Turner ranch with her carpetbag and her chin up, Wesley came in from the fields at dusk and found her at the kitchen table doing the household accounts. She had taken this over months ago with his blessing, and instead of going to wash up as he usually did, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and said her name. "Bessie." She looked up. He was standing there with the look of a man who has been preparing something for a long time and has finally run out of reasons to wait. "I need to say something to you," he said. "And I have been working up to saying it for quite some time, so I'm going to ask you to let me finish before you say anything." She set down her pen. She folded her hands on the table. She waited. "You came here when we needed someone," he said, "and you gave us your steadiness and your competence and your good sense, and those things were necessary, and I am grateful for them. But that is not," he paused, tried again. "That is not what I am talking about. What I am talking about is that you also," another pause, a short, exasperated breath at his own difficulty with the words. "You gave Thomas back his father. You gave Clara, you gave her someone to be the child around, someone soft enough for her to lean on while I was not yet back to myself. You gave me someone to talk to in the evenings, someone whose opinion I wanted, someone whose voice He stopped, looked at her with everything in his face that he had been managing for 2 years. "I am not good at this," he said, "but I am asking you to consider whether you might have any feeling for me that might be what I think it is." Bessie looked at him for a long, still moment in the kitchen, with the lamp between them and the smell of supper on the stove, and the sound of the children upstairs getting ready for bed. "Wesley Turner," she said, "I have had that feeling for approximately 14 months. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and she stood up, and he took her face in his hands and kissed her with a directness and warmth and completeness that suggested he had also been thinking about doing exactly this for a considerable time. She put her hands against his chest and kissed him back, and the lamp light pooled warm around them, and the supper bubbled gently on the stove, and neither of them noticed either of these things for a while. When they broke apart, he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, the fully unguarded version of his face, the one beneath all the competence and the grief and the responsibility, and it was a good face, an honest face, a face she thought she could look at for the rest of her life without ever being tired of it. "I would like to marry you," he said, "if you are willing." "I am willing," she said. "I am very willing." He smiled at her again, that rearranging smile that made her heart misbehave. And then Clara's voice came from upstairs asking whether the biscuits were ready, and they stepped apart and Bessie laughed, really laughed, and went back to the stove, and Wesley went to wash up and supper was served, and the world went on. They told the children the following Sunday, sitting together in the parlor after church. Thomas received the news with his customary thoughtful gravity, turning it over in his mind for a moment before saying, "Does this mean Bessie gets a bigger room?" Which was so practical that both adults had to work hard to keep their expressions composed. Clara burst immediately into tears of a completely happy variety, flung herself at Bessie, and declared that she had known this was going to happen because she had prayed for it, which Clara attributed with complete confidence to her own spiritual effectiveness. They were married in January of 1877 in the Caldwell town church, a simple ceremony in front of the Reverend and a small collection of neighbors and friends. Bessie wore her green wool dress with a new cream lace collar she had made herself, and Wesley wore his good suit, which fit him well, and Hector stood beside him as witness with the dignity of a man who took his responsibilities seriously, and Pete Alcott cried a little in the back pew and tried to pretend he was not. Bessie moved from the small east-facing room into the larger room she now shared with Wesley, and for the first time in 3 years, she slept without the particular cold loneliness of a solitary bed, and she lay in the dark listening to her husband's steady breathing and thought, "This is what it is to be home." Life on the Turner ranch continued with a fullness that she had not previously let herself imagine. They were not wealthy, but they were solid. The cattle business was good through the late 1870s, though the great trail drives were beginning to change with the coming of the railroads, and Wesley was smart enough to adapt. He began selling directly to the new railroad buyers and negotiated contracts that kept the operation profitable through years when other ranchers struggled. Hector eventually moved on. He went back to Texas, where his family was, with wages saved and Wesley's genuine regret, and was replaced by a series of hands over the years, some good and some merely adequate. Thomas grew. By 14, he was nearly as tall as his father and had developed a passion for engineering that expressed itself in the construction of an impressive and somewhat precarious irrigation system for the kitchen garden that actually worked, and in long letters to the government land office asking questions about drainage and water management that the office did not know what to do with. He was going to be a remarkable man, and Bessie watched him become it with a pride that was indistinguishable from what she felt for her own. Clara grew into a girl of such vivid beauty and determined personality that every young man in the county was unnerved by her in some specific way, which she considered entirely appropriate. She was sharp and funny and deeply loving in the way of people who feel everything intensely, and she wanted to be a teacher, which she announced at the age of 12 and did not waver from, and which no one who knew her doubted she would accomplish. In 1878, Bessie found herself pregnant for the first time. She had been careful not to expect it, having had no children in her first marriage, and so when the evidence became unmistakable, she simply stood in the kitchen for a moment with a dish in her hand and felt a wave of something so large and complicated that she had to sit down at the table. Wesley came in and found her sitting there. He looked at her with immediate concern. "What is it?" he said. "Are you ill?" "No," she said. She looked up at him. "No, I am Wesley. I am going to have a baby." He stood very still for a moment. Then he crossed the room and sat beside her at the table and took both her hands in his, and his eyes were bright with something she recognized because she was feeling it herself. He brought her hands to his lips and pressed them there and held them. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Terrified," she said honestly, "and happy, extremely, both at once." He laughed softly. "Same," he said. Their son was born in March of 1879. He was robust and loud and arrived with considerable determination, which the doctor said was a good sign, and which Wesley said was entirely Bessie's influence, which she told him was a questionable theory since he had contributed to the process as well. They named him Daniel James Turner James for Bessie's first husband, which Wesley had suggested, which had made her cry for 20 minutes and love him more than she already did, which had seemed impossible. Daniel was a fierce, energetic baby who grew into a fierce, energetic child who immediately made Thomas's life considerably more interesting. The 1880s brought change to Caldwell in the way that decade brought change to most of Kansas. The great cattle drives were winding down as the railroads extended further south, and the open range began to close with the coming of barbed wire. Wesley transitioned the operation more toward a mixed farming and ranching model, adding crops and reducing the herd size, and adjusting to the new economics with the pragmatic intelligence that had kept the ranch running through hard years. It was not without difficulty. There were 2 genuinely hard years in the mid-1880s when drought hit, and the crop yields were poor, and the prices were wrong, and Wesley spent many evenings at the kitchen table with the ledger, and a look Bessie knew meant he was doing the arithmetic and not liking the answer. She sat with him on those evenings. She had always been good with figures, and she understood the ranch finances as well as he did by now, and she was useful in the practical sense, able to see where costs could be trimmed, where they had a margin, what they could defer, but more than the numbers, she was simply there, which was sometimes the more important thing. "We will be all right," she said, one evening in 1885 when the drought numbers were particularly bad. He looked at her over the ledger. "You don't know that," he said. Not harshly, just honestly. "No," she agreed. "I know that we have been all right before when it seemed unlikely, and I know that you are not the kind of man who gives up without fighting all the way through it, and I know that there are 2 people at this table instead of 1, which always helps with arithmetic and most other things besides." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it. "When I put that posting up," he said, "when I wrote it down and tacked it to the post outside Hazel Pruitt's store, I was not in a good state. I was not in any state at all, really. I was just trying to keep the children alive, and I did not know how to do anything." "I know," she said softly. "I did not know it would be you," he said. "I did not know anything like you was possible." She looked at him across the kitchen table with the lantern between them and the sound of Daniel asleep upstairs, and the night outside vast and dark and full of prairie wind. And she thought about that morning 11 years ago, her carpetbag on the porch, his hollow eyes in the doorframe, the dirty dishes and the quiet children, and the whole enormous uncertainty of a life that had just broken and needed to be rebuilt. "Neither did I," she said, and squeezed his hand. The drought broke the following year. The ranch recovered, the children grew. Thomas left for the city in 1886. He had received a scholarship to the Kansas State Agricultural College, which was perhaps the proudest moment of Wesley's parenting life, and certainly in the top 3 of Bessie's. He came home at Christmas, and letters arrived from him regularly, detailed and enthusiastic about the engineering courses and the new agricultural science and the things the world was becoming. He had also found, at the college, a young woman named Helen who featured in the letters with increasing frequency and was clearly remarkable in Thomas's estimation. They married in 1889 and came home to the ranch for the wedding celebration with Helen, who was sharp and warm and practical, and immediately got along with Bessie as though they had known each other for years, which was a relief and also not a surprise, because Thomas had always had his father's good judgment in the people he chose. Clara completed her teacher's training in 1888 and took a position at the school in Caldwell, the same school she had attended as a child, and was by all accounts an extraordinary teacher, demanding and funny and deeply invested in her students, particularly the ones that other teachers found difficult. She lived in town during the week and came home on weekends and filled the house with her particular energy and the long, eventful stories of her week that she told over supper with the narrative flair of someone who had a genuine gift for making the ordinary interesting. In 1889, Clara announced that she intended to marry a man named Robert Clay, who was a surveyor and a good man, and who looked at Clara with the frank adoration of someone who was fully aware he was punching well above his weight and was grateful for it. Wesley liked him. Bessie liked him very much. The wedding was in the autumn, a joyful and somewhat chaotic affair because Clara approached everything with joyful chaos, and Bessie wore a new blue dress and danced 3 reels and felt, standing in the town hall where she had first danced with Wesley 13 years ago, a fullness of happiness that seemed almost too large for one person to hold. Daniel, who was 10 by the time of Clara's wedding, was the family's youngest and noisiest member, and would remain so for several years, until the births of grandchildren began to challenge him for that distinction. He was obsessed with horses in the way that some children are obsessed with a single thing to the exclusion of most others, and the horses on the Turner ranch had never been better cared for, because Daniel considered their welfare a personal responsibility. He had his mother's auburn hair and his father's gray-green eyes, and the determined chin that seemed to have attached itself to everyone on the Turner ranch regardless of blood relation. The 1890s arrived. Bessie and Wesley were in their 40s, which was not old but was not young either, and the ranch had settled into a mature, proven thing. Not the anxious, vulnerable operation it had been in the 1870s, but something established and rooted, with a history now, with decades in its bones. The land that Ellen Turner had loved and that Wesley had held on to through grief and drought, and the attempts of men like Dillon Marsh to take it had become something permanent. The kitchen garden that Bessie had planted in the spring of 1875 had grown and evolved and been tended for 15 years, and was now a serious and productive plot that fed the family through the summer and supplied preserves through the winter, and that Bessie walked through every morning with a satisfaction she could not quite put in words. They had built a new room onto the house in 1881, which had been necessary with Daniel growing and Thomas still at home. They had repainted the house in 1887, white with green trim, and Wesley had put new boards on the porch, and Bessie had hung pots of geraniums along it in the summer. The house that she had walked into with her carpetbag in 1874, the house with the dirty dishes and the unwashed floor and the pot on the stove that needed cleaning, was barely recognizable now. It was a proper home, earned through 20 years of daily investment. Thomas and Helen came back to Kansas in 1892 with their 2 children, a boy named William and a girl named Jane, and bought land 2 miles from the Turner ranch, close enough to be in each other's lives with ease. Thomas had gone into agricultural engineering as a profession and consulted for ranchers and farmers throughout the county on water and drainage and soil management, which was exactly the thing the region needed as the grassland farming intensified. And he was good at it, and respected and quietly proud in the way of a man doing meaningful work. Wesley watched his son from across the supper table one Sunday in 1893, when the whole family was gathered, Thomas and Helen, Clara and Robert, who had come from town. Daniel, now 14, and already taller than his father, and Bessie caught Wesley watching Thomas and saw the expression on his face. She reached under the table and put her hand over his knee, and he looked at her with a private smile. "Ellen would have been very pleased," he said quietly when the others were talking and the noise covered them. "Yes," Bessie said, "she would have been, and you should be, because it is partly you." He looked at her steadily. "It is mostly you," he said, "for Thomas and Clara both. The years when I was not yet myself what they are now is largely what you gave them." "What they are now is themselves," she said. "We only tried not to damage it." He turned his hand over under hers and held it, there at the table in the middle of the Sunday family din, and it was such a small thing and such a true thing. And she loved him with a completeness that 20 years had only deepened, the way rivers deepen over time, carving their channels more truly into the land. Daniel grew through his teens with the fierce, focused energy he had always had. He was not bookish like Thomas or brilliant like Clara, but he was capable and honest, and had a gift with the horses and the livestock that was genuinely exceptional. An instinct for animal management that Hector, who came back for a visit in 1891, immediately recognized and praised. By 17, Daniel was effectively the head of ranch operations alongside his father, taking on the daily management with a competence that left Wesley increasingly free to do the work he had always preferred, which was planning and thinking about the land, what it needed, what it could give, how to keep it healthy for the long term. The town of Caldwell changed through the 1890s in the way that all frontier towns changed, becoming less wild, more settled, more permanent, the rougher edges smoothed down by civilization's insistence on arriving sooner or later everywhere that commerce found its way. The saloon that had burned down twice in the 1870s was now a respectable hotel. The dirt Main Street had been graded and graveled. The church had a proper steeple. The schoolhouse where Clara taught had been expanded to accommodate the growing town. There were still hard things. The panic of 1893 hit the agricultural counties hard, with prices falling and credit tightening, and several ranches and farms in the county going under. The Turners survived it barely, with the ranch accounts reduced to their leanest margins and Wesley and Bessie eating simpler meals than they had in 20 years, and planting the largest kitchen garden she had ever attempted to extend the household food supply. There were weeks that were genuinely frightening. But they had been through hard years before, and they had each other, and they had Thomas's agricultural consulting bringing in some income, and Daniel's horse breeding operation that he had started with 2 good mares and a stallion that was beginning to pay dividends, and they came through it. By 1895, things had stabilized. By 1897, they were comfortable again. In the spring of 1900, Daniel married a girl named Lucy Bowen, who was from a farming family in the next county, and who was exactly right for Daniel in the way that some people are simply exactly right, fitting into the shape of the person's life as though they had been designed for it. Lucy had dark eyes and a practical temperament and loved horses nearly as much as Daniel did, which was essential. They moved into the newly built addition on the far end of the Turner Ranch house, and the house expanded its identity again to accommodate them. Bessie was 52 in 1900. Wesley was 56. They were not old, and they did not feel old, though the mornings required a little more patience than they had once required, and the cold weather sat in Wesley's knee, where he had been kicked by a horse in 1888 in a way that predicted rain accurately enough to be genuinely useful. Bessie's hair had gone from auburn to a deep auburn silver that Wesley told her was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and which she told him was a compliment he was obligated to give. He said he was not obligated, but he intended to anyway. They walked in the evenings, in the summer and fall, out across the land of the ranch in the long gold light. This had been their habit for many years. The walk covered the same ground every time out past the north pasture fence, along the creek line where the cottonwoods had grown enormous over 25 years, across the low rise that gave the view of the whole property with the house white and distant at the center of it, and back along the eastern edge where the kitchen garden ran in its summer abundance. They talked on these walks, or they did not talk, with the equal comfort of people who had been together long enough to be fully at ease with silence. On one such evening in the summer of 1901, Wesley stopped at the top of the low rise and looked out at the land with the particular expression he sometimes had, the private, taking stock expression that she knew was his way of reckoning with time. 27 years, he said. Since I came, she said. Not a question. She knew where he was. Since you knocked on the door with your bag and your chin up, he said. I was not in a condition to deserve what you did. You were in a condition that required it, she said. That is what I came for. He looked at her in the evening light. His hair was mostly silver now, and there were lines in his face from decades of sun and wind and the weight of difficult years, and she thought he was more himself than he had ever been, more present in his own skin, more sure of who he was, the way long practice makes a thing true. I did not know how to thank you for a long time, he said. I was not the language, for it was not available to me. You showed me, she said, every day, every ordinary day. He took her hand. They stood together on the low rise with the ranch spread below them and the prairie light going warm and low behind the horizon, and Bessie thought of all the mornings, the dishes, the biscuits, the lantern light, the difficult winters, the dancing, the arithmetic, the reading aloud, the brandy by the fire, the small blue book on the kitchen table, the hands taken in the dark, the children grown, the grandchildren beginning, the 27 years of daily, ordinary, extraordinary life. I would like to stay right here for a good long while yet, she said. So would I, he said. So would I. They walked home in the last of the light. The early years of the new century continued to be full and good. Thomas and Helen had 3 children now, William, Jane, and a small, energetic boy named Samuel, who everyone agreed was more trouble than the other 2 combined. Clara and Robert had 2 daughters and a son, and Clara was still teaching, which she would do for the rest of her working life because she could not imagine doing anything else. Daniel and Lucy had their first child in 1901, a boy they named Wesley James Turner, Wesley for the grandfather, James for Bessie's first husband, whose name had been carried forward now through Daniel's middle name and into the next generation, which felt to Bessie like a particular kind of completeness. Young Wesley, as they called him, had his grandmother's auburn hair and arrived into the world with the lung power of someone who intended to be heard, which boded well. The house on the Turner ranch had become, over 30 years, the center of a considerable family constellation, children and grandchildren, and the spouses they brought and the friends of those children, and the neighbors who had known Wesley and Bessie since the early days, and who came to the house for Sunday dinners and harvest celebrations and Christmas gatherings that required every chair and surface available, and sometimes some borrowed from the church hall. Bessie cooked at the center of all of it with the same competence and pleasure she had brought to the first simple supper in October of 1874, though the kitchen had been improved twice and now had a proper range and a pump inside and storage that did not require her to reach things from the top shelf. She cooked for 20 people at Christmas without losing her composure, and for 2 on quiet Tuesday evenings with the same care. And the family around her table was the proof of something she had not known to want until it was given to her. A life built from the ruins of loss, built piece by piece and day by day, until it was as solid and real as the house around it. In the spring of 1904, Wesley was out mending fence in the east pasture when his knee gave out in a way it had never done before. Not the old ache from the horse kick, but something new. A sudden and complete failure of it that sent him down into the grass with a sharpness that alarmed him. Daniel, who had been working the next section over, was with him quickly, and they got him back to the house, and the doctor from town came out and said it was the cartilage, worn from years of hard physical work, and that Wesley needed to rest it properly for several weeks and be gentler with it thereafter. Wesley was a thoroughly unreasonable patient. Bessie managed him with the same steady, affectionate firmness she had applied to every other difficult situation of their life together. She kept him off the leg for the required time, found him enough leisure work and reading and correspondence to keep his restless hands and mind occupied, tolerated his complaints about being confined to the house with the patience of a woman who had been dealing with the man for 30 years and knew exactly how long the storm would last, and got him back on his feet in good condition. "You are impossible when you are ill," she told him at the end of the 3rd week. "I have always been impossible when I am ill," he said. He was sitting on the porch in a chair with his leg extended in the warm May sunshine, a much better humor now that he could at least be outside. "This is correct," she said. "I have been aware of this for a long time and I chose to stay anyway." He reached out and caught her hand as she moved past him, and she stopped and looked at him. 30 years come October," he said. She looked down at him in the sunshine with the prairie at his back, and the geraniums she had hung along the porch railing in their pots, and the enormous cottonwood that had grown from a sapling in their first year into a proper tree that shaded half the front of the house. 30 years, she agreed. "I want to do something," he said, "to mark it." "We don't need to do anything," she said. "I know we don't need to," he said. "I want to." He organized it quietly, with Daniel and Clara and Thomas in on the plan, and what he produced on the first Saturday of October 1904 was a celebration at the ranch that gathered every person who had been part of their life together. Clara and Robert with their children, Thomas and Helen with theirs, Daniel and Lucy with young Wesley, who was 3 and deeply interested in everything. Pete Alcott, who was now farming with his wife and 2 sons 2 counties over, and who came with genuine warmth and a bottle of excellent whiskey. Neighbors from across the years. The Reverend Hartley from the church, old Hazel Pruitt's daughter, because Hazel herself had died in 1892, and it was Hazel who had put the posting paper in Bessie's hand in the first place, and it seemed right to have her daughter there. There was food and music, a fiddle player and a man with a harmonica, and people talked and ate, and the children ran around the yard in the last good warmth of the October afternoon, and it was the ordinary, extraordinary fullness of a life that had been built one day at a time. Wesley stood with Bessie in the middle of the yard in the afternoon light while the party moved around them, and he took her hand in both of his, and he said, in a voice low enough that it was just for her, "You came here as a housekeeper 30 years ago." "I did," she said. "And you are still here," he said. "And it is the best thing that has ever happened to me, after the children who could not have become what they are without you. So perhaps I should say it is the best thing that has ever happened to me, inclusive of the children, which is a large thing to say, and I mean every word of it." She looked up at him. 30 years. She was 56 years old and he was 60, and they were standing in the yard of the ranch that had been a broken thing when she arrived and was now this. This fullness, this abundance, this gathered family in the October light, and she felt the weight and the warmth of it all at once. "I came here because I needed the work," she said. "I stayed because you were worth staying for. And this," she gestured at the yard, the people, the house, the land, "this is not what I expected. I did not know to expect anything this good." He kissed her in the middle of the yard with everyone around, which was not something he had ever done publicly before, and which caused Clara to say, loudly and with great satisfaction, "Finally," which was a comment on something she had apparently been holding since approximately 1875. They laughed. They danced. The fiddle player played the same kind of slow, sweet song that had been playing 28 years ago in the Caldwell town hall, and Wesley and Bessie danced in the yard with the fading October light golden around them, and their grandchildren watching with the frank, beautiful attention of small people seeing something they could not yet name but would remember. And the cottonwood moved in the evening breeze, and the prairie stretched to the horizon in every direction, as enormous and good as it had always been. After the party had wound down and the last guests had gone and the children were sleeping in borrowed beds throughout the house, and it was just Wesley and Bessie on the porch in the dark with the stars overhead, she leaned against him and he put his arm around her and they sat together without speaking for a long time, the way they had been sitting together for most of their lives. "What do you want?" he asked. "For the next 30 years. She smiled in the dark. "The same," she said. "All of this. More of it. The mornings and the garden and the family dinners, and you burned coffee and Daniel's horses and the grandchildren and the walks in the evening and the fire in winter." She paused. "All of it, every ordinary day. That is exactly what I want too," he said. "The years that followed were those years. They were not without difficulty, no life of any length is, but they were good in the deep, root-level way that things are good when they are built on the right foundation." The ranch continued under Daniel's capable management, and Wesley moved gradually from the work of running it to the work of watching it run well and offering counsel when it was wanted. Bessie continued to cook and keep and tend the household with the competence that had never left her, though she let Daniel's wife Lucy take on more of it as the years went on, not because she was incapable, but because watching a young woman build her skill and confidence in her own kitchen was its own pleasure. The grandchildren grew. Young Wesley became a boy of passionate opinions about horses, exactly like his father, which everyone found deeply satisfying. Thomas and Helen's William went east to college and came back with an engineering degree and joined his father's practice. Jane became a nurse, a profession that in 1914 and the years around it would be more important than anyone standing in the Caldwell yard in 1904 could have imagined. Samuel became a veterinarian, which surprised no one who had watched him with animals since childhood. Clara's children grew too, with their mother's brightness and their father's steady disposition, and the family kept expanding its circle outward like rings in water. By 1905, Bessie had been at the Turner Ranch for 31 years. The east-facing room where she had spent her first night was a linen closet now. The quilt that Ellen Turner had made had been carefully preserved and hung in the parlor, where it had been for 15 years. Bessie had suggested this, a long time ago, because she thought things made with love should be seen, and because she had never had any quarrel with Ellen Turner's memory. She had always understood that Wesley's love for her did not diminish what he had felt for Ellen, and that this was not a problem but a proof of the kind of man he was. There was one evening in the late fall of that year when Wesley and Bessie were sitting by the fire in the parlor, as they had sat by fires together for 30 years, and he was reading the newspaper from Wichita, and she was working on a quilt of her own. She had been making it slowly for 2 years, a complex pattern in blues and greens, and the fire spoke and the wind moved outside and the house was settled around them like a living thing that knew its inhabitants. "Bessie," Wesley said. She looked up from the quilt. He was looking at her over the top of the newspaper with the gray-green eyes that had weathered 31 years alongside hers and were as dear to her as anything in the world. "I love you," he said, the way he said things that were plain and true without decoration. She looked at him across the fire for a moment. "I know," she said. "I love you too, just as plainly." He went back to his newspaper. She went back to her quilt. The fire burned. The wind blew across the endless Kansas prairie, the same wind that had blown on the October morning she had walked 2 miles with her carpetbag to knock on a grieving man's door, the same wind that had carried the sound of fiddle music on a September dance night, the same wind that had rolled across the land for all the years of their ordinary, extraordinary life together. In the spring of 1906, Lucy had another child, a girl this time, dark-haired and fierce and named Bessie after her grandmother, which was presented as a gift and received as one, and which made the older Bessie go quietly into the kitchen and stand at the window and look out at the garden that was just beginning to come green again after the winter, and let herself cry for a little while with a happiness too large and too complete for any other expression. She had come to this house to keep it, to cook the biscuits, to make things clean and orderly and functional for a man who had lost his way in his grief and 2 children who needed someone to lean on. That was the transaction. That was what had been asked for and what she had agreed to. She had been there 32 years. The garden was full. The house was full. The parlor had Ellen's quilt on the wall and books on every shelf and photographs crowding the mantelpiece. Thomas and Helen at their wedding. Clara on her wedding day with her bright, defiant grin. Daniel with his first prize horse. Wesley and Bessie themselves on their 20th anniversary. Standing in front of the house with the white paint and the green trim and the geraniums, and 30 years of living behind them in the boards and nails and mortar of the place. There was a photograph of Hector Vargas, too, which Wesley had taken when Hector came to visit, because Hector had been there at the beginning and deserved to be remembered. The small girl named Bessie, who was 3 days old in her cradle in Daniel and Lucy's end of the house, would grow up knowing the wide prairie sky and the smell of the kitchen and the sound of her grandmother's voice reading David Copperfield aloud. The complete edition with all its pages. The one with the blue cover that her grandfather had bought in a bookshop in Wichita in the summer of 1875, because Thomas had mentioned that his father's housekeeper had a copy that was missing the ending. She would grow up knowing the love story of this ranch in her bones before she ever knew it in words, the way children absorb the true things of their world before they have names for them. The way her grandfather looked at her grandmother when he thought no one was watching. The way her grandmother put her hand over his knee under the table. The way they walked together in the evening across the land that had been theirs for all the years that counted. She would know, as the older Bessie Turner would one day tell her when she was old enough to sit at the kitchen table and truly listen, that love is not always the thing that appears in a burst of feeling and declares itself with trumpets. Sometimes it comes through a door with a carpetbag and the morning light and a question about wages. Sometimes it builds itself out of biscuits and arithmetic and a blue book and a slow dance in lantern light. Sometimes it is made of 30 years of ordinary mornings and the fire in the evening and the steady presence of someone who stays. She would know this, and it would be enough. It would be more than enough. It would be everything. Bessie Turner set down her dishcloth and dried her hands and walked out through the kitchen door into the April morning, where the garden was green and the sky was enormous and the cottonwood was full of new leaves. And Wesley, who was supposed to be resting his knee, was walking the fence line along the north pasture the way he always had and would keep doing as long as his legs allowed, and she could see him from here. The silver of his hair and the set of his shoulders and the walk of a man who belonged to this land and to this life and to her as she belonged to him. She stood in the morning light and watched him, and she thought, 32 years, and still here. It was the best thing she had ever done. She went inside and started the biscuits.